Hey, in today's video, we're going to talk about the Minnesota Purchase Agreement. And I'm Travis Anderson. I'm here with Peter Lindquist. I'm excited to go through the purchase agreement in detail for you. And so please like and subscribe, comment on this channel. Hey, Peter, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I've been excited to talk with you about this because it's really a source of discussion for my buyers that they don't see until they find a home. So I'm excited to hear everything we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, honestly, agreed, right? I mean, we review this with our buyers at the time of purchase. This will give our clients and your clients a chance to see it beforehand. All right, awesome. I'm on page one of the purchase agreement here. Uh, Page one is your standard contract. You know, it's who's going to buy what for how much and when. And so the very top has the buyer's names. It has earnest money here. It has the property address. And then page two, it continues with the mortgage. So it's what type of mortgage are we obtaining? Are we amortizing that over a 30-year period, a 15-year period? What's the maximum interest rate allowed? And then we have the contingency. And so there's a couple of checkbox options here. This has to deal specifically with the earnest money. And on page two, we check a box that the purchase agreement is contingent on the mortgage being able to obtain. And so in the event that we can't obtain our mortgage for any reason, these are the things I never like to talk about with my clients, you know, whether it's a job loss, a death, or something like that, then we would retain our earnest money as buyers.
On line 77, when it talks about a contingency date, so your agent often asks, if you're closing on April 30th, that we can prove that we've got a loan approval by April 15th or something like that. The main thing there is that there is a sense of urgency. Once you have got an accepted purchase agreement, we need to be busy as you and I, buyer and lender, we need to be busy on getting your loan approved in a timely fashion in order to meet that date.
Yeah, great point. I always tell my clients after we get the purchase agreement accepted, they always say, "What now?" I say, "Call Peter." And when he says jump, you just say, "How high?" Because we just got to get going on that. In the event that we have that written statement that you're describing and it kind of lights a fire, well, then we have to decide how the earnest money gets retained. If after that written statement happens, a lot of times if you don't close, we're going to forfeit that earnest money to the seller. There's a section here that talks about work orders. We don't see it very often, but if it is an FHA or a VA financed offer, sometimes there's work that needs to be done that the appraiser calls out, right? And so we sort of decide here on, how much is the seller going to do before we renegotiate the purchase agreement. And then we have the escape clause. That's with FHA and VA financing. And what that says is if the appraisal comes in, which is a third-party opinion of price, if the appraisal comes in below the purchase price, then the buyer does not have to buy the home. We can renegotiate. They can bring more money to the table. As we get to the fourth page here, we get to something that's pretty common is seller contributions to buyer's costs. And this is if we're going to ask the seller to contribute some of their proceeds to the cost to the buyer's purchase. And that cannot be the down payment, but we can cover mortgage costs and title costs and maybe some insurances and taxes and stuff like that. The best way for me to describe this is if we write a purchase agreement for, let's say, $410,000, and then we ask for the seller to contribute $10,000 to our cost as a buyer, we might as well have just written the offer for $400,000. And so we're actually, the way I like to describe it is we're inflating the price of the home to cover our costs. It says very plainly here that the seller is paying those costs, but only because we're willing to pay more for the home to cover the cost. And then we move on here on page four. It starts talking about the inspections. We can elect to have an inspection or we can decline an inspection. We can make it contingent on that inspection or not. Usually we're not doing intrusive testing, and it talks about that here. Intrusive would be maybe we're removing sheetrock to look at the insulation or something. Usually we're not doing that. But the purchase agreement, what it allows here, if we elect to inspect and we make it contingent on the inspection, then on the next page, page 5, we put a number of days in there. And if anything happens during that time frame, the buyer can cancel for any reason and they can retain their earnest money. This is probably the biggest protection for a consumer in Minnesota. It is not the same in Wisconsin. This is very specific to Minnesota. But what I like to say is we advise inspections. The market will demand if we would advise otherwise. And then there's a time frame where you as a buyer can cancel for just about any reason.
And who pays for that inspection?
The buyer typically pays, and there's the visual inspection is today at the time of recording this video is probably $400 to $500, and then you could do secondary testing. You could test for radon, you could test the sewer, you could do a mold moisture testing. Most people are doing at minimum the visual inspection. $400 to $500 paid by the buyer. We've got, if we have a home to sell, here's where we add that contingency. And then we talk about the taxes. The property taxes, we're usually prorating those. And what prorations means, if I were to close on May 30th, I as a buyer am responsible for the property taxes the following day. And the seller is responsible all of the way through the end of May 30th. So that's what a proration means. And then in the next page, on page 6, it talks about if there's any assessments on the property. That would be, again, tax assessments, and that would be specific to the property taxes and work being done maybe on the streets or the sewer or street lights or something like that. Page 6, we talk about the type of deed. Now, the deed would be like who owns the property, right? And so we just describe here on what type of a deed we're going to transfer from seller to buyer. We've got information here about when are we going to obtain possession of the property. Is it immediate, or are we going to, take possession of the property a couple of days later? It talks about damage to the property. If there's any damage to the property after the purchase agreement, but before closing, the seller obviously is responsible for making those repairs, whatever that might be. And then in the event that the seller is unwilling to do that, the buyer then could cancel. The other thing I like to bring up is default. We talked a little bit about earnest money. You described what that is and the importance of it. And we talked about a couple of protections. Earnest money is protected during the inspection period. It's also protected due to the mortgage, a job loss or the appraisal, or if we can't obtain the mortgage is probably the best way to put it. If we cancel the purchase agreement for one of those reasons that's in the contract, no big deal. You get your earnest money check back, and hopefully we go find another home. If for some reason we decide to cancel that hasn't been previously agreed upon in the purchase agreement, then that's called default. And in that instance, the buyer may lose their earnest money. I always like to tell my clients, you probably should lose your earnest money if you default, but we do end up getting into like a legal conversation. And so the real thing that I like to say, and it has a statute here, but I just like to say you may lose your earnest money. It talks about the seller's disclosure or a seller's disclosure alternative form. One of these two forms will be provided to the buyer at time of purchase agreement, and that's the seller's knowledge of the condition of the property. Page 9, the top of page 9 talks about if we've got a well or a septic, and if it's connected to the city sewer and water. And then we talk about home warranties and if we want one and who's going to pay for that. And then the very bottom here, it talks about who's representing who in the transaction. And so you have, most sellers have their own realtor, most buyers have their own realtor. We disclose to all parties who that is. And then all of the way at the bottom, we write into the purchase agreement today, which is new this year, or within the last 6 months, I should say, how much is the compensation to the buyer's agent, and is it coming from the seller?
Would you agree that in most cases it is coming from the seller, or should the buyer always be prepared to be bringing that money to closing?
Yeah, great question. I think we can answer it. In most cases, we are negotiating it in the purchase agreement and the seller's paying. And so if you're competing and you've got, and what I mean by that is there's 3 buyers writing a purchase agreement on the same property, you might see buyers choose to pay their own commissions. In most cases, we're writing it into the contract and we're negotiating outright. Again, that's at the time of this video. That might change in the future. I'm not sure, what the market's going to demand, but currently that's what we're seeing. The next page of the purchase agreement, Peter, talks about dual agency, but essentially, if the listing agent and the buyer's agent are in the same office or the same brokerage. And essentially, we have to disclose that to the consumer so they're aware of that. And then on page 11, we have a couple of other small disclosures. The big one is that the purchase agreement has some addendums or amendments. Everything is numbered, so nobody can sneak anything in to the purchase agreement without the buyer or the seller's knowledge. But once it's agreed upon and signed, it's an agreement, it's a contract, it's a legal binding document, and then it has rules that we have to follow. And then the last page of the purchase agreement here, it talks about if there's a counter offer. And so that's line 498. If we submit an offer for 425,000 and then the seller asks us to pay 435 and we come to an agreement on that, there's another document called a counteroffer form, and that will supersede this purchase agreement. That's why we check that box, because it means that you, the lender, and the title company and realtors, instead of looking at the first page for the purchase price or all the terms, we would look at the counteroffer that would supersede anything. And then we have a signature page.
Can I say on line 515 and 516, it's something
Yeah.
for buyers to understand that it's a legally binding contract. Okay, I've had two buyers in my career who said the same thing. They said, "Oh, I signed a contract, but it doesn't really matter." I
Right.
mean, literally, that was the words on their face. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It actually does, but.
Yeah, I totally agree. Listen, we can give all the advice in the world as realtors around this document while we're putting it together and we're negotiating it. Once it's a valid contract, and if there becomes a dispute, in other words, the buyer and seller have a disagreement about what they have in this contract, it now becomes a legal matter. We can sometimes figure that out as realtors, right? Many times we can't. And to your point, I've sold over 1,000 homes in my career. I've seen litigation 2 or 3 times. So it is not common for buyers and sellers to litigate a dispute in real estate. But that's what you would have to do if there was one.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to be with us today while we talked about the Minnesota purchase agreement. I want to thank Travis Anderson for the detailed view on what a buyer needs to know about today's contract when you're buying a home in Minnesota. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, great job, Peter. Thanks. Appreciate it.